3D games suck. Okay, they don't all suck, but I think in some cases, some 2D games are better than some 3D games. Now, I'm a child of the 80s. I grew up on games like Pac-Man, Space Invaders, Frogger, Legend of Zelda, the first one, Super Mario Brothers, and I think in some cases, some 2D games are more superior than 3D games. I actually made a few 2D games myself. About 15 years ago plus, I actually programmed a game called Ninja King, and it was on download.com, and it had about 30,000 downloads, which was actually a big deal back then. And also another game called Last Ashika, which was basically an RPG. And so I actually really enjoyed programming that, and I preferred to keep it in 2D, even though 3D was still pretty relevant in that time, because I felt that 2D offered a better experience. When I started playing games, I started off with the 2D games, and I remember Wolfenstein coming out. And Wolfenstein was really the first 3D game with textures on it. Most 3D games were just geometrical shapes, and it had textures on it, and it was all the rage, and it really took off. And I really thought, well, what's the big deal? I actually liked the 2D games, and after that, you started just seeing more and more 3D games, and I didn't like that. I mean, a little bit of balance would have been nice. And it really struck me just a couple weeks ago when I actually dusted off, my old emulators for Super Nintendo and Nintendo, and I started playing Street Fighter 2. And I actually enjoyed Street Fighter 2 more than Street Fighter 4, which I have on my PS3. And when I thought about it, I was like, you know what? Games really haven't changed all that much in the last 20 years. I mean, graphics have gone better, and that's really the biggest thing. But in terms of, the sound is what it is. I mean, basically from a 16-bit to an 8-bit, it's improved once it got to the CD quality, but sound hasn't changed that much. And some games have gotten bigger, but for the most part, the quality of gaming hasn't necessarily changed that much. But even playing a game like Angry Birds, which is a hugely successful game in today's age, which is so simplistic in its interface, but that's the thing about 2D games. You can just jump in there and just play it. Even for people who don't even play games, you just know how to play it, and that's how games were back then. You didn't have to learn all the combos. You didn't have to go on the internet and find all the hidden spots out there. It had all that stuff too, if you really were into games, but it's just so simplistic, and you just jump in there and get going. And Angry Birds is an example of how a game even that's 2D in today's age can be so much more addictive than any 3D game. But also when I played Ultima 6, which aside from Oblivion, this is actually my favorite game. I actually then dusted off my old copy of Ultima 6, found out it didn't work, so I actually had to download something from DOSBox.com, which basically allows you to take DOS versions of games and play it on Windows. There's also a Super Nintendo version, which I don't really advise because the game is really simplified to be, a lot user-friendly and easier, which takes away a lot. And there's also a remake, which uses a Dungeon Siege engine made by a group called Team Archon. But Ultima 6 was the first open-world game that I played, and it was released in 1990. And basically, you can move any object, you can kill anyone, and you can just free roam wherever you want to go. And that was just such a revolutionary concept, and it really blew my mind back then. So I started playing that again. I played the remake made by Team Archon, which I think is a fantastic piece of work, but I actually preferred to play the old Ultima on the DOSBox version. And because it's not the same way I envisioned that world when I played the remake. Now, mind you, again, I think they did a great job with that. But I also have a bit of bias, because part of that bias is because I have nostalgia. I'd play the game and I have a certain association or certain memories would come back in my mind of seeing a gargoyle for the first time and being like, wow, that's crazy, or fighting a dragon. And, I think obviously that, there's a bit of bias in that respect. But I also do think that 2D games allow us to see things a little bit differently in our gameplay experience. 3D gaming strives towards reality. And our mind doesn't always want reality. We have our conscious mind, which likes reality, and our subconscious mind, which is the irrational. And 2D games, I think, appeals more to that irrational mind. It's like when we dream. We see things that, someone floating up in the sky, it doesn't seem to make sense, but, our brain accepts it. And our brain also fills in the blanks of things that it doesn't have rational understanding of. So basically when you hear a sound when you're sleeping from outside, like a loud banking noise, in your dreams, you actually then, your brain automatically then integrates that into its reality or its perception. So I think 2D games is the same way. It fills in the blanks. Like your brain realizes, hey, this is not completely realistic, but it has a way of accepting the reality and for you to meld with it in that different way. It's like reading a book. Like when you read a book, often when people read a book and then see the movie, they're often disappointed because they have their own interpretation of that reality. And then, reading the book, it's a very it's a very open reality, and then seeing the movie, it's a very fixed reality and interpretation from the director and the actors. So I think 2D gaming allows for that wider experience, which you can actually then interpret in your own given way. Now, I understand why 2D games are less prevalent than 3D games, because 3D games, are much more commercially viable. Like people, when they buy a game, the first thing they do, they flip it over and they look at the box and they look at the graphics. And if it's not impressive, it's going to be a hard sell. And and if you don't have some game that you have some sort of association with, it is hard to get over those superficialities at first. Even with Ultima 5, which I'm playing, there's also a remake, and there's also the old version. Now, the old version is really a big difference in graphics between Ultima 6. But I'm actually choosing to play the remake because I don't have a built-up association with it. So, I do understand it, and even in some cases, yeah, I'm going to have my bias towards 3D games. But I do think that 2D games allows that different reality and how you actually perceive things, like reading a book versus watching a movie. So you know what? For those of you who've never played a 2D game, download a Nintendo emulator, download an old DOSBox game, give it some time, play it. You might enjoy it. Again, it takes a little bit of patience, but I think you might be pleasantly surprised as to what allows you to see in a different way. So check some 2D games out, and do them some justice. Happy gaming.
Ah!